Hi, greetings. Welcome to Step 6, Configuring Role and Role Binding Manifests. In Kubernetes, the way we declare a role and a role binding is through a formal manifest file that can be written in either YAML or JSON. In this case, we're going to create our role and role binding in a YAML file. On the left, you'll see a manifest for a role. How do we know it's a role? You can see kind role. And then it declares the API version. This is all pretty standard within Kubernetes manifests. Then if we look at metadata, we'll see there's a name property. In this case, we're going to name the role pod reader. And also, we're going to assign the role to the namespace test. You'll see there are rules, and as you might recall from earlier steps, the rules say what the role can and cannot do. So in this case, we're saying that the role pod reader can access any object in the core API group, core resource group, but not any object, because we're going to filter it down a little more. We're saying, really, look, the role pod reader can access API resource pods, and the operations that pod reader can perform upon the resource pods is to get and list. So pod reader can do nothing more than get a pod. And that's pretty much it. Now, if we look at the role binding, formal kind role binding, and it has the API version, it's in the namespace test, which is also the same namespace that the role is in. So this means that both role binding and role can see each other. Then we're going to give the role binding a name, user pod reader. Naming is arbitrary. We could just as easily call this role binding my cool role binding. The important thing to understand is role binding is a named artifact. Then we're going to declare the subjects, and this means who can be assigned to this role. In this case, we're going to get a subject of kind user, and the user we're going to assign to the role is Dick Tracy, and in later steps we'll look how Dick Tracy comes into existence. And then for the role reference, we're going to say it's a kind of role, and the role that's going to be associated to the role binding is pod reader. And then the API group that this role reference exists is RBAC authorization K8SIO. The important thing to understand is that in order to make a role operational with a user or group or even a process, there needs to be a role binding in force.